Awesome.
Okay, so I can hear everything's good now. I don't know what was going on there for a second.
Perfect. I
All
just,
right.
the good old reset.
It did. It did. Well, thank you, Mr. Degner, for coming on. Justin and I are two friends who met a little over a year ago now.
Okay.
Both have come from very different circumstances in life. Justin is originally from South Africa, has a bunch of fun stories of how that world worked. Myself, I am from Central Virginia, but in the meantime, we both have come to enjoy or kind of viewed the world through some of the work that you've done. And the reality of it is we have never really found anybody to talk fully on the topic of inflation culture or how
Hmm.
family formation is ultimately being affected um, via inflation. With that, we are both heavy believers in the Bitcoin protocol and how that also plays into this as a potential off ramp.
Sure.
Myself, I have a little understanding of Austrian economics, nothing to the extent that you do, but in the meantime, really just wanted to kind of examine your work thus far. Didn't know if
Sure.
you wanted to kick us off a little bit of what you're doing right now and what kind of led you to this viewing, I don't know, culture or society in this fashion.
Well, I think I can start with the work that I'm doing now. I'm beginning a larger project on what I'm just calling the political economy of the family. And that is really coming out of my dissertation and a book that was the result of that dissertation. And it's interesting, the book title sort of masks the real point. It's simply called Inflation and the Family. But the dissertation title, you can be a little more um, elongated in your title. For marketing purposes, you have to have sort of a snappy title for a book. The dissertation title was The Family in the Inflation Culture. And that title was part of a project that I needed to agree to before starting my PhD studies. And I was working under the supervision of Jürgen Guido Holzmann, who is known to some in the Bitcoin community. In fact, I think he's at a Bitcoin conference coming up here shortly. And in any case, he is highly respected in Austrian circles and especially as a monetary economist. And one of the things that he had written in a book in 2008 called The Ethics of Money Production is that fiat currency is, it's a powerful phrase here, a juggernaut of social, economic, cultural, and spiritual destruction. And he has a few footnotes that allude even to his words, the diabolical nature of fiat money. So you hear almost a spiritual or a cultural or even religious tinge to this. And as a person that had, yeah, I'd say, a religious upbringing and a faithful Christian to this day, I think that that really resonated with me. And the more I studied, not only the impact, right, but the core problems with property rights confiscation through money printing and seigniorage, that I see a spiritual problem at the root. And so to merely look at or consider inflation as a CPI goes up, CPI goes down sort of phenomenon. Now, inflation is something else. It is a devaluing not only of money, but I think of human life. And that might come off as a little bit strange to some folks, but I think that when we reach into family life, we see the devaluation of children, we see the devaluation of marriage that are a part of what and Professor Holzman and another sociologist by the name of Toporowski. Holzman was the first to use this phrase, inflation culture. But I think, as awkward as a phrase is, it might make people look a little sideways, but it at least invokes a little bit of curiosity. And ask, what do you mean by that? And so, happy to describe what we mean by that.
Yeah, it's awesome to hear that because that's definitely something you find out in your Bitcoin journey at some stage or another. That there's definitely, the monetary system is the leading domino or one of the leading dominoes of everything, downstream of that the world is experiencing right now.
Yeah,
That
agreed.
is is losing value in, as you said, the family, and not devaluing kids, and all the kind of things that mesh our society together. So
Yeah,
when someone says what's going on with the world, and a Bitcoiner says, well, the money's broken, it's a simple kind of tie
yeah.
back, but you got to get kind of
Mhm.
do quite a bit of studying to figure out all the previous dominoes that get you to that. So
Yeah, and that's one of the issues right now in the world of family economics, as a sort of branch of economics proper, is that we've got a lot of people trying to concoct new policies in places like Hungary or South Korea in order to spur fertility to an optimal rate, whatever that is. That's another issue, but uh, trying to pile intervention on top of intervention in order to get what governing officials feel is a desirable result in terms of fertility and what have you. But my method, and I'm unfortunately, I feel like I'm in a very small minority in this respect. But what we are looking at is declining fertility, more and more delays in marriage across the globe, and asking the question, well, what are the interventions that have gotten us here to this point? And we want to avoid what Ludwig von Mises called an intervention spiral, where you simply pile on another intervention on top of others that have gotten us into the current situation. And when I say we, I am referring to a small group of family economists, myself, certainly Professor Hulsman, but also Catherine Pakaluk, who works out of the Catholic University of America, has become a wonderful colleague and friend, see it the same way, rather than again trying to concoct a bunch of newfangled newfangled forms of favoritism and tax redistribution and so forth. No, we need to chip away and roll back the interventions that have gotten us to this point. And the first place to start, I think, is with monetary interventionism.
yeah, it definitely
Yeah,
feels like these interventions are, the intervention after intervention after intervention is basically like trying to fix something with bubble gum and zip ties and some duct tape, and
Yeah,
then
indeed,
they're not actually addressing the main structural issue.
indeed. One of those here recently in the U.S. You may have seen this highlighted by the Trump administration are the Trump accounts. Now, certainly the idea of saving some money and investing and adding to a child's investment account early on, I'm not going to quibble with that. But what was very interesting to me was at the press conference that was held. Trump had a number of different families come up and celebrate the policy, but one of those families talked about, hey, this is wonderful. We'll get the initial $1,000, but honestly, right now, we're just worried about the cost of diapers, the cost of food, the cost of formula, and so on and so forth. And that's just when kids are young, let alone when they get to their teenage years. You start thinking about college costs, which has one of the highest uh, price inflation rates in the U.S. economy, right alongside healthcare, right? And these two things, education, healthcare, along with housing, are really the foundation of family life and having children, or at least the ability to make sure you have those things secured and aren't having to chase more and more hours and more income in order to keep pace with price inflation in those categories. So those are the issues that are facing families right now. And President Trump has said, well, we're not going to let home values fall, so we're not doing that. Well, so much for the affordability, so much for wanting to see young families form and thrive.
yeah, a lot of what your work that I kind of I can't remember where I initially saw some of your stuff, but I can't remember. Regardless, resonated deeply for someone who is 25 years old, recently married, which is seemingly becoming an oddity, which is, excuse my French, but ass backwards as the how society has been working, family formation, all of that, home ownership. I kind of had to go back and really, I was primed in the school that I went to, and what I call the right way of teaching economics. I didn't really pay attention. I was obviously partaking in some high time preference activities while I was in school. Wish I had paid more attention, but the reality of it is, there's a lot of 25-year-olds who are fresh out of school and are trying to grasp the what just happened here.
Yeah.
I was 7 years old in 2008, so obviously had no idea what was going on there. I saw of many happenings in my family that I couldn't necessarily explain in the period of from about 2008 to 2012, where like normal things that were happening stopped happening. And there's two 9 to 5 parents, that whole world, and it ultimately led to a, I'm not going to say entirely, that's by no means the underlying factor, but it did lead to a divorce. And
Mm.
that part has really resonated with me after looking back for some time on, okay, what happened here. I didn't know if you could kind of walk through the framework that you take in terms of, again, all humans are acting self-interestedly, in that what
Hmm.
in terms of praxeology and
Yeah.
Mises's approach to this, what do you kind of look at how we got from there to here?
Well, the place to start, if you're thinking about what Mises has to say about family life, is in his 1922 book, Socialism. And he has an entire chapter dedicated to that topic. And one of the things when readers of Mises today, we normally think of him as being sort of a classical late 19th century gentleman and this sort of thing. And that's true, but he did have some interesting things to say about marriage. And he, of course, was countering Marxism, right? I mean, of course, the title of the book is Socialism, but he's referring to socialism the way that Marx does, as state ownership of private property, right? There's no private property rights. So a part of that critique of socialism, both on an economic and sociological front that he provides, is that he calls out the fact that, of course, the socialists want to destroy marriage because they see marriage and family life and traditional household life as a bedrock of the exertion and the protection of property rights, not just for your household, but for your children in the sense of inheritance. Of course, we know how the left despises the idea of inheritance, and some of you even suggested that it be taxed at 100%. So the the left, the socialists have always attacked the family. So Mises counters this and introduces the idea that is frankly sort of an evolutionary perspective on marriage and family life. And he makes the argument that in eons past, a family is formed through force and sort of he doesn't use this explicit kind of language, but you can imagine old cartoons where a caveman comes out, clubs a girl over the head and drags her by
You're
the hair
mine.
to his cave. And exactly. So in a way, he sort of portrays the old days as this kind of force-based principle. Well, as property rights develop, and this fits very squarely into Mises's views on property rights, because unlike Rothbard, who views property rights as a part of essentially human nature through the natural law understanding of the world, Mises views property rights as a convention that people figure out if we're acting beings, we have goals, and those goals are to get rid of our unease and to improve our situation. And for Mises, he says that mankind figures out over time that one of the ways to more efficiently meet our goals of improving our lives is to uh, develop and use these things that we call property rights. Okay, so this is an important part of understanding his book, Socialism. But he takes it one step further and says that modern marriage that comes under the concept of property rights and contract have actually created a situation where now, if you have a willing woman, a willing husband, there hasn't been force or coercion
Free
involved.
market.
Exactly, that this creates the conditions for greater and better marriages in the sense of relational, getting along. The voluntary nature of it means that the woman wasn't coerced, and he talks about divorce as really an exertion of property rights in the sense that a woman has the ability to choose to go in a different direction. And so for him, he looks at modern marriage as emerging from an understanding, a Western understanding, you might say, of property rights that has enhanced and improved family life, but particularly for women. So that raises the question, what does economics have to do with family formation, but especially divorce? And here, when I first read it, I did a little bit of a reader's double take to make sure I read it right. But Mises says that economic reasons for people breaking up, divorcing, that's sort of overblown. And he says, if people don't have the fortitude to stick it out, well, they're going to find a way to get out of marriage anyway. It was a very kind of passing comment, and I had to be reminded that Mises wrote this in 1922. He's a pretty young man at the time. He's not married, and so perhaps he wasn't as keen to some of the relational problems that come about under financial strain within a marriage. And of course, if you know his story, he and Margit went through some very difficult times, not only escaping Europe in the outbreak of World War II, but even financially when they arrived in America. It was a difficult life for a while, and they stuck it out. But nonetheless, and to your point, Justin, uh, the divorce question is one that I know I have to be very sensitive in talking about these things because people's lives have been upended and so forth. So you never want to trivialize it. But when we look at the leading reason for divorces, it's typically financial reasons. Either either income expectations weren't met, or perhaps what they call financial infidelity. I even think, we just finished the NCAA basketball tournament here. I even think of sports gambling, where you're in an inflationary culture and people start taking short-sighted, high-risk opportunities to make it big with big bets in the sporting market or gambling of other sorts. This ruins marriages, um, let alone some of the pressures that were faced, say, in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And so, inflationary pressure, the need for both spouses to work full time, maybe full time plus, really creates a difficult environment for just the kind of love and companionship that makes marriage last.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
the name of our podcast is Measured in What, and in this case, we Justin and I both think about this in very different lights. He's 2 generations older than I am,
Just one,
but
just one.
just one, excuse me, one. Sorry about
I
that.
won't tell you how old I
Regar-
am. A little bit of gray here.
Regardless, we talk about this all the time about when he was my age, the amount of time it took for family formation versus today, the physical amount of hours, the fact that one must not only work for the most part, unless you are have found a niche field that you've been able to thrive in, for the overwhelming majority of your average 20 to 25, 26, 27, 30 year olds in that range, really a decade range there, you need 2 incomes. And how does that one also really plays with me in terms of, okay, well, if for I take the traditional family view, child rearing from the mother as much as humanly possible. There are biological connections there. That one plays with me. So, Justin, if you've got whatever questions you want to hit next.
Yeah, absolutely. So just we'll dig deeper into that in a little bit. I just want to kind of jump back up to 30,000 feet. And for listeners who aren't really familiar, I obviously understand you're talking about, in general, the Austrian economics perspective. For listeners that are not familiar with that, what is Austrian economics? If you can kind of give us a quick explanation of that. And then also, how does that differ from what is kind of being pushed and taught in universities today? Because I know Justin, I don't want to say the best of both worlds, but he had, both
Yeah.
perspectives. The Austrian economics one, I've always had a fascination for economics. but I didn't know the Austrian side of it until I kind of
Mhm.
started my Bitcoin journey.
Yeah.
Once you start hearing the principles and philosophies of what the Austrians are saying, to me it was night and day. So if you don't mind touching on that a little bit for potential listeners.
Well, that's a great question. And where I like to, there are a few ways to answer this question, but the place I like to start is to talk about methodology. What does it mean to do economics? And there's a book that Ludwig von Mises wrote later in his life called Theory and History, where he drew a sharp contrast between what people like, famous people that have a free market orientation, like Milton Friedman, and people like Gary Becker, who were a part of what's called the Chicago School. What they emphasize is what economists and people who deal in philosophy in this area call positivism. Positivism is the approach where we look at economic data and then try and figure out a theory based on the data that we see. Well, in Mises's book, Theory and History, he says that's not economics. You're doing history. You're looking at data from the past and describing what has happened in the past. And so, what a lot of people call economic statistics or econometrics today is nothing more than a description of the past. Now, here's another way in which the Austrians differ, because mainstream economists of the Chicago School or the Keynesian School will then take those data points, those conclusions from the past, and extrapolate them into the future and try to predict human behavior as though humans were like rocks or chemicals in a laboratory, right? And so this is a clear distinction that Austrians, we do have a place for the use of data and statistics, but that place can go no farther than just describing the past. All right. Now, on the theory side, Justin's used the word already, and that word is praxeology, and that is the fancy way to say the study of human action. And so that's where Austrians really, that's our bailiwick, is to talk about the consequences of choices that we make. And human action springs out of the fact that human beings they have two features. I like to argue that human beings have two features and a telos or a purpose. But Mises emphasizes these two things to start. He emphasizes that we are both Homo sapiens, we are thinking, we are rational, and we are Homo agents or acting agents. Economic action, economic choice, if you will, is simply the playing out or what you might call the demonstration of what we prefer the most. And so that human action element is really the centerpiece of what makes Austrian economics different than the Chicago School or the Keynesian School. And we feel, put data in its appropriate context with its appropriate emphasis. We still use it, but it's historic.
Yeah, you used the word there, prefer. And to me, the way I kind of look at things is there's no ways anyone can decide what 8 billion people prefer through monetary or central planning.
Yeah, and that speaks to, in one way, right? This speaks to another famous Austrian economist, Friedrich Hayek, who was known for bringing forward what's called the uh, really the information problem, right? He basically makes the argument that central planning is impossible because we all prefer different things, and even individually, we prefer different things at different times. And for a central planner to imagine that they can plan an entire economy to meet all of those preferences the same way that you or I do on an individual basis is, in the famous title of one of his books, a fatal conceit. It is a hubris of central planners to think that they can do this. And Mises takes a little different angle. Mises looks at central planning and more specifically socialism and says, look, you cannot do economic calculation under conditions of socialism. What's the key condition of socialism? It's the state ownership of all property. Private property is banned, and he has a very tight logic that the socialists themselves said, "Oh boy, we've got a problem here. We have to contend with Mises' argument, and it is this: if you don't have property, then you cannot have legitimate exchange, and if you cannot have exchange, you don't have exchange ratios. We call prices, and without prices, particularly money prices, you can't have a rational decision-making process in order to understand what do other people value, what do other people prefer, am I meeting the needs of my neighbors? And so instead of producing stainless steel kitchen appliances and stainless steel pots, a central planner says, well, let's just produce stainless steel nails with no knowledge of how the ultimate consumer uh, and no way to tell what the final consumer really values, because we communicate this through voluntary exchange in a money economy. And so that's what's called the calculation argument against socialism, or what's sometimes called the calculation debate. And that's Mises' argument. And again, Hayek's argument against socialism and central planning is an information problem. And then if you go to Chicago school, I mean, they're correct to say that there's an incentive problem, right? And that's also true. But I think the essence of why socialism can't work really gets down to Mises' argument that when you're stripped of property rights, exchange is not possible. Exchange ratios don't come, and neither do prices, and you can't calculate profit.
Another thing that I have that I've reared back from kind of discussing this because I feel like talking about it with the older generations is kind of tough in some sense. You're looking at it from two completely different angles. You were just hitting on the idea of price points and being able to actually use price as a mechanism of a functioning economy. Can you kind of walk us through the difference of kind of how that operated, say, through the really post World War II up until the 70s under a quasi gold standard that existed for that period, and what we're kind of looking at post 1970, and even you can really use, I think, post 2000 to kind of is your three time frames there and kind of how we've evolved in that sense.
Yeah, so if we want to look at the evolution of the global monetary system, starting after World War II, or right at the tail end of World War II, you have what's called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that was put together essentially by the Allies, the winning side, up in, I believe it was Vermont, Connecticut, wherever Bretton Woods is.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, somewhere in the Northeast here. And it was a modified gold standard. And the idea was that the United States was going to, knock on wood, cross your fingers, was going to essentially print as much money as we had gold at a certain amount, right? And the rest of the world could count on the dollar as being as good as gold. Now, by the rest of the world, we don't mean every single household. This was for governments and central banks who were holding some US dollars and maybe for one reason or another wanted to exchange and convert to gold. They could do so. So France could do this, the other countries in the world could do this if they were holding reserves in US dollars. Well, as time would unfold, you move from the post World War II era into, say, the 1960s and the Lyndon Johnson administration, where you have both the Vietnam War accelerating and massive expenditure there, but you also have the development of the welfare state and the so-called Great Society legislation. And world leaders who understood finance started to say, wait a minute, you aren't taxing your people that heavily. You aren't collecting these tax revenues. Where are these expenditures coming from? And of course, it was, I'm using the shorthand here, it was essentially from the printing press, and the amount of US dollars in circulation globally was not going to get you the same amount of gold that you thought you were going to get. And so famously, the French government under Charles de Gaulle sent warships to New York to say, oh, here's our US dollars, hand over the gold. Let's see if you can literally put your money where your mouth is. And at that point, infamously in 1971, in August 1971, President Nixon goes on television and says that speculators are making a run on the U.S. dollar, and this is a vast conspiracy against the U.S. dollar. Of course, the cause of the problem was U.S. profligate spending and inflationism. So, as the worldwide demand for dollars starts to decrease, that means that its value starts to fall, and that gives rise to the stronger price inflation of the 1970s and what we call the stagflation era. And you know, you were talking earlier about some of the family or life experiences that brought you to a point where these issues were really important. Well, for me, the connection between inflation and family was very real because I was born just long enough ago to remember the late stages of the 1970s stagflation and remember what it was like for my parents to fight over money, for to wait in a gas line because our car had run out of gas, and being in a particular part of town in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where thankfully my dad's car was on a hill that was going downward, and because we had to wait in a gas line and run out of gas, he could just slide it into neutral and slowly brake going down to the road so that we could get a couple gallons of gas. And remembering that as a young child and feeling the tension in my parents' household, I mean, it was very real. It was palpable. And so anyhow, that's kind of my experience. That very early on, though I didn't understand what was really happening around me. Fast forward now to my adult years and starting to study Austrian economics not that long ago, really lifted the lid on, or lifted the hood on what was happening in that economic situation at the time. So very informative. And that's why I love the topic that I get to speak about. I mean, that I get to research. A lot of PhD students go through, and by the time they know their topic, they hate the stuff, and it's just exhausting. But for me, uh, this has a very, very practical, very real, and I would dare say um, humanitarian, or I should say humanistic um, part to it, because I think that inflationism is a part of dehumanizing and defrauding our neighbors, right? So there's a spiritual problem with it, but I also have seen enough situations and felt enough situations where lives and families are destroyed with this monetary system at its root cause that I'm very impassioned about the topic.
Yeah. It's one of the things that Satoshi has a quote that I think it's in the white paper. He says the problem is there's too much trust in these systems, that you have to trust the central bank not to debase the currency. So that was, his whole thesis, for Bitcoin. You coined the term inflation culture. Can you kind of
Well,
unpack that?
yeah, I mean, somebody else did. Again, I want to give credit where it's due. But Professor Hulsman, I think, is in the literature the very first to use the inflation culture phrase. And another one, a very sociologist, not really familiar with the economic literature, but that's Toporowski, is his name. And they used it first, but I think that really captures what we're trying to say here. And I think that as I actually finished the manuscript for the book in December of 2024. And as academic publishing goes, it does take a while to get a book produced and put out there. So that didn't come out until about June of 2025. But of course, I was thinking a lot and meditating on the idea more and more after the book and this idea of the inflation culture. But there are really a couple different key elements to an inflation culture. One is a politically driven economic inequality, right? And the mechanism through which this happens is what economists call the Cantillon effect. And the Cantillon effect is named after Richard Cantillon, who was an Irishman but became a French citizen, so that's why I call it Cantillon. I guess if you like the Irish pronunciation, you can call him Cantillon, but my professor lives in France, so we go with the French pronunciation. And what Cantillon describes in his essay on commerce, and there's a free book, a free PDF download you can get from Mises.org, and I really encourage people to read part 2, chapter 6. And in it, Cantillon describes how even in a gold commodity money system, when you have new money produced, whoever receives the new money first has the ability to purchase goods and services while prices have not risen. Right? So the first recipients, if you will. And then they make specific expenditures. And the cool thing about reading Cantillon is that he puts it in household terms. He said the households of those who are the first recipients, they will purchase more beer, more wine, finer linens, have nicer furnishings in their homes, and so forth. And then the craftsmen that provided those goods and services, they too will have a little bit more, and prices in the broader community haven't quite been bid up that strongly. And so they have a lot of purchasing power. But as that new money creation continues, or even just a one time injection, you will see prices tend to rise. And that means that the later recipients are left with less purchasing power than they were in the first place. And Cantillon goes even further than that and says that if things are, if prices rise enough and they're on fixed incomes, they just may move to another nation, another country. So you can see out, or rather emigration, as a result of being on the losing side, one of the late recipients. So that's one of the key features, right? So what do you get here? Well, you get a sort of a political class structure when you have a central bank that is creating money in this way, and the first recipients, of course, receive it through political will or political connection. Now, what does this do socially? Well, of course, this creates a sense of the haves and the have-nots, and that's not healthy in a culture or society. You also have movement toward whatever the tastes of the original recipients are. And this becomes very important when we think about government expenditure, when government is one of the first recipients. Because whatever they decide to spend on, that's going to transform the labor markets where those expenditures are going. And it's a matter of deliberate choice, right? So it's not sort of random, okay? You have real actors. This is the Misesian element where the new money comes into the economy and you have specific people making specific choices based on their preferences. And so one of the ways that we also see transformation of culture, or the inflation culture, is that when you have these expenditures and government is doing it, they're going to direct it towards certain industries or activities. Well, if you look here, even in recent months, what we see is that government expenditures are largely targeting education and healthcare. And what do we see in the job numbers, right? Again, like this is what Austrians do. We've got a theory to explain why we're seeing the numbers we're seeing. And so government makes expenditures in those categories. We see growth in employment in those areas right now. And very interesting, wouldn't you know it, that healthcare and education, these are predominantly female labor forces. So take it just one more step. What does that mean for the family? What does that mean for traditional approaches to family life? And you know, that's just one thing that's happening right now that pulls all of this together. You have money, pulls the whole Austrian story together. You have money creation by a central bank and its policies and its member institutions. You have government borrowing that money and releasing it through certain expenditure channels, and labor force is transformed as a result. Now you go back to the Biden administration, and they're just using those expenditures to hire government employees, right? But either way, there's a deliberate choice being made about where these new expenditures go, and that fundamentally transforms labor markets in ways that are not directed by the actual market, voluntary voluntary exchange. So you have this increasing equality that is based on government decisions and where their expenditures go. There's a couple other elements that I talked about. One is an increase in moral hazard. We can talk about that real quickly. And I see one category of moral hazard is just risk taking and chasing yield. And I already mentioned like gambling, right? You've got people in the middle and lower classes who are engaging in these activities, trying to keep up somehow. And if you get a couple payments behind on your car and you're desperate, you might do something foolish. And so that's a very sort of corrosive impact as well. So increased inequality, increased moral hazard, those are two really important categories. But super important is the rise of the debt culture that comes through inflationary policies. Of course, in our day and age, the mechanism through which monetary expansion happens is through credit expansion, and that is something that is largely controlled by your oops, sorry. So yeah, credit expansion through the banks, and we see that one of the areas of credit expansion that's really impacting family formation is credit expansion in the higher ed area.
Okay.
But we know that the more debt that young people take on in their college years in order to effectively make a living in an inflationary world is you got to get that lambskin, as they say, and get that college degree so you can get into a higher paid profession so that you can pay off those debts. And wouldn't you know, it just takes a little more time for you to get married.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to go back real quick,
yeah.
Sorry, Jeff, you mentioned with the, I've always called it the Cantillon effect, but that we'll call that the African pronunciation. I don't have the French one with me, but you mentioned that logically it obviously has to play out in a quote unquote sound money standard that has with a gold standard, the stock to flow is way more constrained in terms of the expansion of the monetary unit compared to a fiat where it's just, you can just issue credit and debt, ad infinitum, ad nauseum, just going crazy.
Exactly.
So that stock to flow is kind of a restraint mechanism on how bad the Cantillon effect can get to society.
And when you're producing money in sort of the natural way, mining for gold and silver, right? It's costly to do so. And for entrepreneurs to engage in mining, they have to believe that it's going to be profitable in the end. And this puts, you might say, a geographic or a natural physical limitation on the creation of new money, meaning gold and silver. And so that's that natural limit. And I mentioned already that my faith background is very important, and some of those statements about Christianity by Professor Hulsman were there was a lot of gravity to that for me. And one of the things that Psalm chapter 2 says is that the rulers of the world, they shake their fist at God and they want to throw off his shackles. A few different translations of this, but throw off his fetters. Well, this is the idea that the ruling class wants to reject all natural constraints. Yeah, I think that's very profound when you think about what the state does in what their aim is in the pursuit of central banking and fiat currency. They want to throw off natural restraints so that they might expand their power. And of course, fiat money, and we know its connection to war and the exertion and expression of state power. If you've got fiat money, you can let it rip, so to speak. And we're seeing that right now in Iran. I mean, heaven's sakes, this kind of insanity doesn't happen if you have natural constraints, but they've been cast aside.
Justin and I have this philosophical conversation often where we've gone back and tried to play like a game theory, how one nation state that is on a sound money standard versus one that's on an inflationary, fiat standard, who wins, because momentarily the fiat country is unrestrained from, as you said, natural law. So they're able to kind of get more with nothing until obviously the system collapses.
Yes, and this touches on an idea from Thorsten Polite. He's an Austrian economist living in Germany right now, and he has coined a phrase called collective corruption. And the idea here is, let's say you have that scenario. You have two nations, one who adopts and retains sound money, and the other who adopts fiat currency, and the fiat ruler decides it's time to seize some territory, right? Well, if you're going to survive that that kind of onslaught, then the nation with sound money, they have a choice to make. They can either try and keep pace and adopt the fiat approach themselves or face annihilation. And this is, of course, a politically very difficult, if not impossible, decision to make. And that is really the story of World War One, right? It's that you had some countries who were tied more closely to a gold standard. If they wanted to make war, they needed to tax the people. And of course, the people only have so much toleration for that. And the way to combat a fiat nation with a fiat army is to try and match them gun for gun and bullet for bullet. And if you have the natural constraints of a gold or silver currency, then you're going to have a difficult time keeping pace, so to speak. And so this is again an example where the consequences of remaining on a sound money standard are too costly, frankly. And so that's an example of collective corruption, but it's also the idea of what we see right now in the United States. I have great empathy for young people, and I've worked with young people in both the high school and college ranks through my career, and so I am not one of these Gen Xers who, finger wags at young people saying, "Hey, just stop buying your Starbucks and you'll have a house in no time." Like, I'm not at all. I think that's completely misreading the situation, um, and even yeah. So I say that because now I'm at a stage in life where the system I've been a part of and come up in has been one where, well, frankly, your house is part of your a little bit of part of your retirement plan. It shouldn't be, but for most folks, it is. So I face the problem. I've got kids. I want to see them have the same kind of successes and enjoyment in life that my wife and I have had. But if I were to push the button and eliminate central banking right now, that would take me into a really difficult spot, all right, because of where my investments are at, right? So what do I do? What do I advocate for? Well, on the one hand, I know what's right, which is to say we need to return to sound money, but it will be at my detriment, right? And so the game goes on, yeah. And nobody really has the will to go ahead and push the button. And this is a question that I get asked sometimes, and I know other Austrians get asked it. But and it goes something like this: if you had the easy button to just abolish the Federal Reserve right now, um, or would you kind of do it in an orderly sort of fashion? What would you do? And I answer this two ways. I say, well, I'm a lot older now, and so I would prefer a more orderly sort of thing, so I can shift some things around, and we'll get there in say 10 years. But the reality is, in our political world, some folks say, well, no, you can't just do it, right? There's no political will for that. But you know what else there isn't political will for? There's no political will for like a 5 to 6, 7 year plan to dismantle fiat currencies and return to sound money. So which
Mm.
is more likely? Like either way, you're going to wind up at a crisis moment, and there will be a button that gets pushed. And I think I share this concern with you all is that when the crisis finally hits again, that the button that's going to get pushed is not one for sound money, but it's going to be for central bank digital currency. So if you give me the button on my desk right now, knowing that we don't have a long run political plan or will to get it done, I would press it. I would abolish it.
Yeah, it is. Sorry, I just want to make sure I was unmuted there. You're gonna have to cut this, Justin. But regardless, yeah, it is very, very interesting that back and forth of like, again, from your perspective, from our perspective, like we know where the world has to go, but like in order to get there, there would be physically physically and mentally and spiritually a even more upheaval that we've already seen or than we have seen thus far in a
Mm.
very short amount of time. So like again, this how this plays out is nobody can really say for sure, but it is interesting nonetheless to just see how people ultimately think it will play out. Regardless,
Yeah.
I know that you're working on another book. Are you able to touch on or hit on that at all? I was very interested in the little bit that we talked earlier on it.
Sure, sure. So my first book was Inflation in the Family, but as I've thought about it more and worked and talked with more scholars, I want to expand the project to a broader political economy of the family. And when we talk about political economy, what we want to do is look at a natural human interaction like family and imagine it, construct it in a way that is absent state intervention. And so now this project starts, right there. But instead of introducing only monetary intervention, I've worked with or been on a panel. This is back in October with another scholar by the name of Philip Bagus, and he presented a paper on the same panel where he described state culture, or what you might call statism. So if Mises had socialism in 1922, I think statism might be the title for 2026. And as I've been thinking about it, I think that there are um, three main pillars of statism and interventionism, and they are. And I'm still working this out. I mean, even I've got notes down here from today, thinking how I should rework this. But right now, I've got regulatory intervention, fiscal intervention, and monetary intervention. And that these are the three pillars of statism. Now, the regulatory one is very sort of broad. Think of all of your regulatory agencies. Think of the Department of Education, everything from that to the SEC. And you can hopefully see how, take the Department of Education, for example, how might what it does impact family life? Well, they determine when kids go to school. They determine how school lunches are allocated. They currently, this is going to change. Apparently, the U.S. Treasury is going to take over student loans. We'll see what happens there. But right, they have regulatory mechanisms that reach into family life. Does the FDA reach into family life? Well, you bet they do. You bet they do. When it comes to quite literally food and drugs that we consume in our households. And so the regulatory realities, they they have a lot to do with family life. Certainly, fiscal intervention. We already talked about inheritance tax. We already talked about, we didn't talk about it, but you can see how various tax systems on income versus consumption, or both, or property taxes, inheritance taxes might impact family life. And then I already have done the work on monetary intervention and how this influences family as well. So I want to create really a larger project, but be more concise in each of those areas and build that project out and show how the state is a threat to traditional families in whatever part of the world they're in. One element that I'm going to try and incorporate into this book is really a generalizable story about what happens with families in different parts of the world when statism and those three pillars are introduced into society. Because you have different family types in different parts of the world. And to generalize something on a global scale, I'm going to need to probably do my heaviest lifting there in this project, is really just to look at the sociology of families in other parts of the world. But that's the project, really showing that the state itself is a threat to the family and to its flourishing.
Jeff, I'm curious to know what your perspective on Bitcoin is. How far down the Bitcoin rabbit hole are you?
You know what? I'm not very far. I'm sad to say because I'm now meeting with you guys. A few months back, I met with Robin Sayer
Hmm.
um, over in Austria, I believe, and So I'm still gaining an education in Bitcoin. Now, back prior to COVID, I had gone to uh, to physical silver accumulation. So doing some of that, and of course, there's been a nice run up here, but nothing to the percentages that we've seen with Bitcoin. And I've heard and learned enough that I think that people who say that Bitcoin is not going to work out are not listening very well. For example, the idea that the government is going to confiscate it from you. My understanding, limited as it is that that's not. Uh, that probably makes Bitcoiners just shake their heads.
It's
This is not the way this
mathematical
works.
impossible. Yeah, if you
Yeah,
understand.
this isn't how this works.
Yeah,
And so something that's confiscation free or free from that threat. Right, and of course, we learned under the FDR administration that even gold and silver can be threatened with confiscation, even out of your safe deposit box. So, as safe as you can get in sort of mechanical, physical terms, we've seen what happens already.
yeah. You can't send it overseas. You can't travel with it in large amounts. Um, that was one of the things that when you understand sound money and the gold standard and everything that it, all the positive effects of why gold was, became de facto money was because it was the hardest element to reproduce. It had the highest stock to flow ratio, and it was hard money, but it's still had, because it's physical, it has its limitations. And once, from our perspective, Bitcoin solved all the challenges of gold. And our philosophy is, we would push that button right now.
Yeah.
Obviously, because we heavily positioned in Bitcoin, and we believe from a philosophical standpoint, all of the things that you've been kind of explaining to us from a family standpoint, from a social standpoint, all the fabric that binds us as humans together with all the good stuff. Bitcoin, the Bitcoin thesis, aligns with that perfectly. It's stateless money. It's unconfiscatable. It's undebasable. You know what the monetary supply is. All the game theory kind of intertwined into it. It's fascinating. So I feel like you're so close to becoming a Bitcoiner.
Well, and that's in my conversation with Robin, I really am. I feel like I'm a naturally inquisitive person, maybe annoying to a point, but I will readily admit what I don't know. One of the things that he expressed to me, and it's been just a thought experiment challenge for me, is understanding money as a medium of exchange. Right, this is how Mises defines it. And okay, I know that at the moment it's not a broadly accepted medium of exchange. However, what Robin talked about was the fact that right now it is a tremendous store of value, especially if you were one of the early adopters. But I wouldn't be surprised at all to see if it continues to grow. And um, I don't know about you guys. I'm always hesitant to make predictions of how price points is. This has been drilled into my head by my Austrian colleagues and my mentors. Look, we can do pattern prediction, but don't go out there doing point prediction. That's just
Right.
you're asking for trouble. But nonetheless, um, what Robin explained was that's a part of sort of an evolutionary process where you move from being a store of value and serving several other functions into the medium of exchange, right? Because what does the state do? The state just declares that their paper money is legal tender. They just declare that it is for exchange. Um, and what we understand from like Carl Menger on money is that no, money emerges naturally, and that does not happen with a snap of your fingers. It does take time.
I don't know how true it is, but there have been some rumors that came out very recently now that Iran are accepting it as a medium of exchange for payment for ships to go through the strait. So
Okay.
it could be a complete, not true, but
yeah,
it would make sense.
Well, and I heard that they were also saying, we'll accept euro dollars or euros instead, other currencies, right? So we think about the BRICS posing an alternative to the U.S. petrodollar. But really, strategically, historically, diplomatically, that's basically exactly what the United States did to Great Britain in 1956 when they went to shut down the Suez Canal. And because the Brits had so much debt to the US, America said, all right, American leadership at the time said, okay, if you guys don't back off of this, then we're going to call in your war debt. And essentially, that is, uh, I'm an economist, I'm not a financial economist, but that's this sounds a lot like that, right? Because if U.S. dollars come back home, uh, that in itself, I hesitate to use the word hyperinflation because again that's point prediction, but it will not be pretty. Let's put it that way.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. Again, the I actually read, I think it was maybe right before I had found you, but was reading The Ethics of Money Production, and that one line stuck out tremendously, and
Mhm.
the calling fiat inflation this juggernaut of spiritual, cultural, and economic and social destruction. That was like during my journey. Like I couldn't have found a better sentence to like sum up like what I was thinking about, like
Yeah,
looking back on how everything played out, looking at how I have to more or less protect myself and my money as in terms of time and energy or as a representation of time and energy going forward. How do I preserve that through
yeah,
time and space? Your work just was very fascinating. So I just wanted to say thanks.
yeah. Well, Justin, and real quick, I mean, to be super practical, we've talked about family. I, like you said, I am this close. How did you all, Justin Woodall, I know that you are married. I don't know if Mr.
I'm married,
Blankenberg,
yeah.
you are as well. Yeah. How did you talk your wives into it?
Into Bitcoin or getting married?
Both, both
Yeah.
probably.
Dude, what
I'll
was the
say
conversation like? I mean, I'm
it
curious.
took it wasn't really a single, I can't, and my wife will admit this as well. There wasn't a single conversation, but it was like kind of me walking through and like so like as we are out in public or I see something that like kind of triggers my thought process on
Mm,
like, okay, how did this get from where it was 50 years ago to where it is right now? Showing
yeah,
shrinkflation, some of these
yeah,
other just minute items that nobody like think when you look at it in public, you're looking at a McDonald's cheeseburger. I'm looking at it, it's like, wow, this is way smaller than what it was a year ago, 5 years ago, tomato, tomato, whatever. Small stuff like that, and kind of walking through. Also, kind of not, I guess when my wife came home all excited, this was at the beginning of the year, she was all excited about her raise that she got and kind of just walking through, okay, what are you, in what terms did you get a raise? And then kind of walking through
in what
the
terms? Yeah.
inflation of items X, Y, and Z, and kind of, again, the basics of that. So again, I can't say that it was a single conversation where it kind of like clicked. But there's also some good there's some fiction books that do a really good job of explaining Bitcoin without the book being a Bitcoin focused book.
Yeah,
Kind
yeah.
of
Okay.
some basic use cases of it. So that was my take on it.
Have you
Great,
read the
great.
Bitcoin Standard, Jeff?
I've read parts of it. One of the things that I incorporated into my book was Safe's chapter on fiat food.
Mm-hmm.
And right again, I mean, you're doing household life and you got kids, you're doing food, and I have some unique um, health challenges that are genetic in nature, but I, I am I don't know how to say this. I mean, the U.S. fiat food system is an atrocity.
It's atrocious. It is horrific.
I mean, and
It's poison.
I watched my own mother pass away this last year of lupus. Just a life of inflammatory um, experience. That it's the food. It's the food.
Or what we call
That's
food. It's not
yep.
even food.
Yeah. It's yeah. I don't know what even to
Industrial
describe it
sludge.
as. Yeah. Yeah.
Something along those lines. But
Engineered
any last,
consumables.
yeah, something like that. Any last thoughts? Again, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to find, or maybe I just wasn't looking in the right spots, but the again, for me, personal experience. Everybody is shaped by different things, different happenings, whatnot. Family, economics, how that played out when I was very young was very impactful on where I am today, what I'm focused on. So just wanted to say thanks again.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for having me, and
Appreciate it.
yeah, feel free to reach out anytime.
Absolutely appreciate it. Thank you. Hopefully we can do this again in the future.
Yeah, I would love
Let's
to.
circle back.
All right.
Yeah,
All right.
if you don't mind staying on, we just have to
Sure. Yeah,
before
make sure
you
everything works.
leave, so
Yeah,
it's all
I'm gonna
uploaded.
press stop now, and then it should give you a